now. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We are very excited about this second webinar in the Ask an Expert series, which is a webinar series hosted by Marine Renewables Canada. MRC is the National Association for Tidal, Offshore Wind, Wave, and River Current Energy. And over the course of the next year or so, we will be hosting a series of webinars with experts from around the world to tackle Canadians' biggest questions about offshore wind. Today, we're tackling the issue of environmental impacts and effects of offshore wind. And before we just get started today, I just want to take a moment to recognize with all of you and to acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands that we're all calling in from today. In particular, because we're discussing offshore wind, I wanted to invite us all to think deeply about the impacts of renewable energy projects on Indigenous communities, and to reaffirm our commitment together today to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy projects move forward in Canada respectfully and inclusively. So before turning it over to our expert guest, Dr. Courbis today, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping notes. As I mentioned earlier, we're recording this webinar and it will be posted on MRC's website and YouTube page. The bulk of the webinar today will be a presentation by Dr. Courbis, which will be followed by a question period. So feel free to type your questions into the chat during Dr. Courbis's presentation. I'll be monitoring that, and we will address questions at the end of her presentation in a question period. There's also a Q&A function that you're welcome to use and a raise hand function. The Q&A and the chat are great just because if we happen to not get to your question today, at least we have a record of it and we'll do our best to follow up afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our expert guest today, Dr. Sarah Courbis. Dr. Courbis is a marine protected species and regulatory specialist with the Worley Group, and she has been working in marine science and regulation for over 25 years. As a senior scientist with the Worley Group, Sarah focuses on marine protected species, and she specializes in impact assessment, permitting and compliance, and mitigation measures for the various environmental impacts. So she's a wonderful guest for us to have on our topic today. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah, and I will hand it over to you and stop sharing so that you can begin your presentation.
I will try to share my screen here. Let's see. All right. Is that working?
Yep.
Okay,
perfect.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to move this over here and move that over there. All righty. Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. As Alyssa said, I am with Worley Consulting, and I do a lot of work in offshore wind these days here in the US. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to folks in Canada about some of the things that we've been doing down here and some of our lessons learned around offshore wind environmental impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stressors associated with fixed and floating wind, some of the impacts, including some beneficial impacts, mitigation and monitoring to address some of the adverse impacts, and also a little bit about stakeholders and First Nations, as well as some disinformation issues we've been having down here, which I imagine that you've heard about up in Canada. So I figured it was worth touching on. So to start with, there's a number of different stressors that can affect marine wildlife and habitats from offshore wind. So if you're operating in shallower waters, you're going to have fixed platforms that are pile driven into place, monopiles or jackets, which you can kind of see in this picture here, as well as if you're out further into deeper water, you're going to have floating platforms, which will have moorings and often midwater cables that would actually be, out where people might be able to interact with them, or animals might be able to interact with them. In the shallower areas, the cables are typically buried under the ground. And then you have substations, which are depicted in this little offshore wind farm diagram here, which can be offshore and onshore, as well as connection into the grid. And so I wanted to just remind folks that in an offshore context, there's still a fair amount of terrestrial infrastructure that's involved in moving electrons from the ocean environment and to people's homes onshore. There's also port development that's anticipated to create situations where you can actually assemble and muster the different wind farm parts, as well as the different types of boats that are necessary in order to do both the installation and the long-term maintenance. Prior to building a wind farm, you also have to do a variety of survey activities, and that's depicted in the other picture here a little bit. So there are sound sources that are used for some of that survey activity, and of course it's boats on the water. So there are some pre-construction, construction types of stressors, and then the long-term, operational stressors of having some structures in the environment, some noise and electromagnetic fields and things that are generated by that equipment into multiple years. Usually wind farms are anticipated to run for up to 25 years. So what are the potential impacts from these different stressors? Of course, there is the potential for some harm, obviously, to wildlife. Particularly, there are concerns around birds, and we've done a lot of work down here in the U.S. to study the vulnerability of different types of birds, and different birds fly in different ways, fly in different parts of the air column. One of the things that we've been stressing here is that we use a lot of maps where we say, here's like the density of animals, the density of whales, or the density of birds, or whatever. But even if there's a high density of an animal, if that animal isn't necessarily highly vulnerable, you may not be doing a good job of citing and mitigating if you're focused simply on numbers of animals versus their actual vulnerability to the stressors. So some birds are more vulnerable than others to collision or displacement. And so those are the types of birds that we're trying to focus our attention on here in the US. And we need to do more research on where birds are using the air column and how they change where they are in the air column dependent upon different weather conditions and night and day and different things like that. So there's been quite a bit of research that has been undertaken here as well as in Europe in looking at how birds can interact with wind farms. Behavioral change is obviously something that can happen if you're particularly, we've been concerned about that in the context of pile driving and noise, and then behavioral change can also be affected by lights and things like that. So we've developed a wide variety of guidances and different strategies and mitigation measures to try to minimize those things, and we'll talk a little bit about that in later slides. There's certainly concern about how the installation of wind farms can affect the habitat itself. It can potentially have beneficial impacts, but also it can alter habitat and in a way that could displace certain organisms or create connectivity for invasives or things like that. When you start looking at this in a more like big picture sense, there's also questions around what does the deployment of a lot of offshore wind turbines look like in terms of having any effect on currents, or because wind affects currents, and then structures also can affect currents. Are there any concerns? And there have been some studies again on that, both on the east and west coast of the US, and looking at what are the sort of modeling the changes that can occur from this large scale amount of structure. And then you also want to look at individuals can be affected by offshore wind, but what does this mean in the context of population level impacts or cumulative impacts across either multiple wind farms or wind farms and other things going on in the environment, like fisheries, for example. So there are some beneficial effects, so I don't want to lose track of that. And you've probably heard people talk about the fact that there can be reef effects, which you can argue could be beneficial or not, depending on what it is that you want to have in an area. Reef effects, or sort of a de facto kind of small marine protected area around a wind turbine where people aren't necessarily getting really close to it, could be to the benefit of animals. And we have found in doing research here in the US on Block Island Wind Farm, for example, which was installed, I think, in 2012 as 6 turbines. There's been an increase in certain types of recreational fish, that the recreational fisheries have enjoyed an improvement in their ability to find and catch those fish. That's something we've found too in the Gulf of Mexico in the context of oil and gas structures. A lot of people use those types of structures as fish aggregating devices. Also, I think it's important that we remember that there are climate change concerns that are much more existential threats here. So not that we obviously have to mitigate the impacts of offshore wind, but we also have to think to ourselves about the question of what happens if we don't start doing more renewable energy and look at energy diversity and energy transition. So a lot of the impacts we're seeing to animals today are related to climate change. You can see up in the corner here a little out of a publication, a thing about birds, where there's a lot of birds that are under threat from climate change and likely to go extinct. So doing nothing to transition our energy sources is going to have some pretty serious impacts on animals too. So we want to be thinking about that in the context of what are our trade-offs. There can be a real benefit to research platforms too. I am, as a marine mammologist by trade myself, I'm really excited about all of the data that we've been able to collect in the last 5 years over on the East Coast of the United States, relative to all of the different wind developers putting out different systems, or people who are studying things for the purpose of understanding effects of wind farms. You have very large academic coalitions with pretty decent funding from Department of Energy and from developers to collect data. We're learning a lot more rapidly about animals like North Atlantic right whales, and this is a great platform for us, as well as all of the long-term operations that are going to go on for wind farms. So there'll be people out there. You'll have a boat that's out there doing things already. The cost and logistics of doing research at sea is very challenging. So having these research platforms could be really beneficial. Some of the offsets that folks may do in different protected areas, for example, with birds, often one of the mitigation measures is to protect nesting habitats and other important habitat for birds if you might have an effect on birds in another environment. So these types of offset investments could be really valuable. As well as, I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that there still is a lot of energy poverty in the world. There are a lot of people who do not have access to energy sources that are reliable and clean, and that has a trickle-down effect in health and safety and just any ability to really, with so many countries industrializing, we really need to be, I think, in North America, it's important for us to be leaders in energy transition and energy diversification and improving access to energy for everybody. In terms of the adverse effects, there are a lot of different mitigation measures that we can take to help address those. Of course, you do have to think about how you prioritize that. And we have been struggling here in the US a bit with not necessarily having good interaction around how to integrate mitigation and optimize it, so that we still are struggling with things where we have redundancies or conflicts in our mitigation practices and very large and complex sets of mitigation. So for example, at Vineyard Wind, I heard a presentation a few months back where they said they have over 1,500 individual environmental mitigation measures that they're trying to apply to their project construction. That's challenging for sure. So trying to integrate those things together across different statutes, I think, is something Canada might think about, creating more pathways for that in advance. We didn't really do that. Each of our agencies and statutes were somewhat individually applied, although there was an effort to create what we called FAST 41, which was an infrastructure alignment bill. But I think still at the end of the day, we did a lot of this separately, and that's causing some challenges for us in mitigation. But the first way to mitigate is, of course, good siting. So you want to be choosing places to install wind farms where you are less likely to have significant impacts on habitat or wildlife. The noise abatement strategies have been really important here. There's been a lot of technological advancement on noise abatement in various capacities. Different types of deterrents to keep animals from, say, for example, birds from landing on things. The cable sheathing and burial is important to reducing electromagnetic fields and heat and vibration, things that are that come from cables. I know Canada also uses protected species observers in your oil and gas industry. That's something that we've crossed over into our offshore wind industry as well. And so when people are doing work at sea, there are third-party observers that are helping to minimize the impacts to protected species, which can include different types of clearance and shutdown measures, different seasonal restrictions about when and where you're installing wind farms, different types of lighting. In the context of habitat on the bottom, scour protection is really important so that you are maintaining the habitat on the bottom. And our research done subsequent to the installation of the turbines off of Block Island has found that the habitat on the bottom recovers relatively quickly from the installation of these turbines if you have the right type of protection there. So that's been good to see. There's a lot of new technology being developed. We recently did a project for the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium looking at gaps in technology and what we kind of need in order to get robust scientific data and integrate things better into the actual infrastructure and operations of offshore wind. And it's really impressive, the technology that's being developed for purposes of monitoring and mitigation. So I think Canada can really benefit from a lot of money and effort that's gone into that here in the US over the last several years. And as I mentioned before, you can always think about how you can do offsets and compensatory type mitigations. The compensatory mitigations in terms of dollars are mostly focused in fisheries here in the US. But there are other types of offsets and collaborations and benefits. My advice to people is usually I think we make a mistake in our stakeholder engagement a little bit where we go into a room and are sort of like, where do you do what? Where do you fish, or where do you recreate, or where do you have tribal artifacts or whatever, instead of walking in the room and saying, how can we work with you to improve whatever the situation is? Like, how can we work with you to help you catch more fish? How can we work with you to get more access to your cultural heritage? How can we, be a benefit to you? So I'm hopeful that Canada can kind of learn from some of the mistakes that we've made with thinking of it as more of a siting issue than that. The mitigation around stakeholder concerns isn't really just about finding some spot that you do want to have least conflict, but you also have to figure out how you can actually be part of the community and work with them. And in the context of least conflict, I should mention too, in the US, we've kind of shifted our model a little bit. Our original siting model was mostly focused on developers going to the US government and saying, here's where we want to put a wind farm, can you evaluate that? And as we went more to a larger scale planning context, we started doing this more in a more similar way to sort of our oil and gas leasing, in that we're looking at areas where people may want to put wind farms, like say the Central Atlantic, where our next lease sale is going to be, and then doing suitability studies across all of the the data that we have, or collecting additional data and putting that all together into studies that will actually do a better job of looking for least conflict areas. But those areas, of course, have to be viable for offshore wind. So there are obviously constraints that are associated with the commercial viability of areas, but within that constraint, you can find areas that have less conflict with wildlife or habitat or fisheries and other stakeholders. So that's been a real benefit in using newer technologies. And I have high hopes for AI and things and getting more into that. In terms of monitoring, I just wanted to point out that, again, there's a lot of different opportunities for monitoring, and this has been a very big focus here in the US, although it's been probably the hardest thing to do. Trying to mitigate something in the moment of construction is one thing, but thinking about how do I collect long-term data and use it to assess whether or not there are impacts that we want to, that are sufficient that we want to change something and adaptively manage it for the future, it's challenging to get data like that. So what we've done here is set up a lot of collaborations. There are a lot of organizations that are working on this. So the example here of the Wildlife and Offshore Wind project is, I believe that's led by Duke University, but there's a huge number of collaborators that are a part of that in the academic world who are specifically sort of collecting and synthesizing data together in order to understand what the baselines and what the potential long-term impacts are of offshore wind. And we also have things like our Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, which was driven pretty strongly by the state of New York, but it's meant to be across the entire East Coast region. And the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, for example, also is a nationwide organization, and that's focused on fisheries science and research. So there have been a number of organizations that have come up and kind of created these structures for monitoring and research. And there's been, as I noted before, a lot of technological development. So if you're interested in some of the latest and greatest on this stuff, I do believe that National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium has our we created a database, which is just a snapshot in time for marine mammal and bird technologies, but it's current because we just did it. So so if you're interested in that, I think that is available on their website. But I can connect people to that after the talk too. So what do we do with all these data? Then we start looking at adaptive management, and this is just kind of, and this might be a little small to read depending on the size of your screen, so I apologize for that. Effectively, in order to adaptively manage something, you do have to have some kind of what's the threshold that triggers some sort of action, right? So you do have to set up something that says if this then that, and then you're going to have to measure you're gonna have to design whatever metrics make sense to measure to figure out whether or not you're meeting whatever that threshold is. This is actually a lot more difficult than you may think in the context of marine wildlife, for example. It can take a lot of data to be able to get statistically robust information about changes in how animals use space. And then on top of that, you have a lot of different variables that are affecting that. Most of the animals in the environment are being driven by underlying dynamic conditions, and they have a lot of interseasonal and interannual variability in how they distribute themselves in the environment. So just seeing animals are like over here this year and next year they're over there doesn't necessarily mean that anything's wrong, or even that the wind farm has anything to do with it. So you really have to collect data around environmental contexts while you collect animal data to understand what those dynamic drivers are. And usually those dynamic drivers affect those animals' prey, really is typically, or if they have some sort of like turtles, for example, are very temperature driven. And so if there's differences in the temperature in a given year, they're going to move to different places. So those kinds of things, you have to really understand that in order to tell whether or not your stressors are having an effect on the animals, or if they're just, having natural variation in their movement and behavior. The other thing in this slide here is this risk assessment. This is part of mitigation and monitoring in the context of thinking about, you can't necessarily mitigate and monitor absolutely everything. There isn't an infinite amount of time or dollars, and even some things are just logistically not very reasonable to do in that, to monitor in that way. So you have to kind of do a little bit of risk assessment and say to yourself, okay, well, what is the likelihood that this is going to happen, and is the impact high or low? Is it like a severe or moderate or low impact kind of thing? And when you get to a space where you have a high likelihood of a high impact, those are places where you're definitely looking to mitigate and monitor. When you have low likelihood things and low impact things, then you have to ask yourself, like, where do I want to put my effort? And if it's something that's a low likelihood but a high impact, you might do some kind of preemptive mitigation for it, potentially because of the high impact component of it. But you really have to think about where you're going to put your energy and money. So that context of a risk assessment framework is really important when deciding how to set up mitigation. And that kind of goes back to that thing about 1,500 environmental compliance items in a wind farm construction strategy. It depends. I mean, sometimes that can be viable, and sometimes you can end up in a situation where you've actually made it so that the project isn't financially viable. And so we have to be kind of trying to balance all of that across the impacts to the environment. There will be some impacts to the environment from offshore wind, from anything, from any kind of energy extraction. And right now, the energy is relying on not only having impacts to the environment from installation and operations, but actually emitting carbon and things that are causing climate change. So I encourage people to be thinking about this in the big picture context and where it fits and what kind of negative impact you have from renewable energy versus sticking with traditional resources. And then finally, the last thing, I guess I want to talk about stakeholders too, so I'm talking about disinformation and stakeholders. So I did want to point out, you guys probably saw this in the news because it was in the AP, like the day that this came, I got so many emails from people. There were, the AP picked up this story that whales were being killed on the US East Coast from offshore wind. And the original story was saying that the surveys being done by offshore wind developers were killing whales because there's humpback whales and right whales that have been in what we call an unusual mortality event, is just where you have more whales than you typically do come up onshore dead. This has been going on for a number of years. It's something like 2016 or thereabouts. So it preceded the offshore wind activities that we're seeing out there right now. But then, this got escalated, and Donald Trump got on TV and said that wind turbines are driving whales crazy or whatever. We don't have. We have 6 wind turbines. So that's not really a very accurate statement, but there you go. You've got, like, it escalates, and then you have a lot of people hearing something, and then how do you combat that? And this is really challenging. And so the industry down here has, been trying to figure out the best thing to do. And we're not necessarily like professional marketers, and plus, you have to say things that are accurate. And the challenge with that is that science is often more complicated than sound bites, right? So it's difficult to explain to people. I mean, we do know, and I will say I've gone to a number of conferences where people do stand up there and they go, "We don't know what's killing whales." That's not really true. And I think, Canada also is well aware of this on their East Coast with there have been, in fact, there's very good research to indicate that climate change is actually the underlying driver of right whale deaths, because right whales are shifting their habitat further north, and they're moving into areas with more vessel traffic and more fisheries activities. And when we do necropsies on these animals, humpback whales and right whales that come up dead, we are often finding that there is vessel strike trauma or entanglement issues that are probably the ultimate cause of those animals' deaths. So there are data, but no scientist is going to stand up there and say 100% of anything. And that's where you end up, having these sound bites. If there's any opening in that explanation for blaming renewable energy, then somebody's going to take that route. We've been looking at some of the things that people have been making claims about in terms of the survey work, for example. They're just the equipment that you're using to collect data for offshore wind is really low energy equipment. It's not the kind of equipment that you use for doing oil and gas exploration surveys, for example, which also there's no real evidence that that causes any death or anything like that. So these claims are just really meant to harm the renewables industry and aren't really factual or concerns. The problem is that when people start spending money and time on something that's not a real concern, then you're not spending that money and time on something that is a real concern, and things that you could do to actually improve the situation for whales. So as a marine mammologist myself, it's really always disheartening when you see people pivot their attention to something that isn't a real problem, to the detriment of genuine issues that we need to face. So I'm hopeful that people can continue to kind of share information. Of course, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put things up on their website, and you can see some of that here on this slide. Not a lot of people are necessarily going to go straight to there. So I encourage, if people ask you about this, you're, at Christmas dinner and somebody's asking you questions about this, there are actually good data on this particular issue, and there are legitimate websites and agency information that you can get. So hopefully that's something you can share with people. But that will happen in Canada too, right? You're going to see this as well. And right whales, of course, are a big issue in Canada, just as they are in the US. I've been sort of interested too in the, we've implemented a lot of shutdown and clearance sorts of mitigations for HRG surveys, which again, the high resolution geophysical surveys, which are again, like not really very high energy surveys and often have a lot of narrow beam equipment and stuff. So, you're going to spend, your vessels are going to spend more time on the water if you have them clearing and shutting down, particularly for things like dolphins, which are mid-frequency animals that aren't really particularly, they aren't that bothered by this stuff. But there's a, if you're shutting everything down, you're going to be on the water longer because you got to go back and fill in all those things, and you're going to have more boats on the water because people need to use the boats longer. You're going to need to have more boats. So then you have more emissions, more noise from vessels in the water, more safety risk for people on the water longer, more vessel strike risk because you're on the water longer. Like I myself am trying to figure out, where's the balance here of minimizing disturbance to animals, but at the same time not really increasing risk of more serious impacts, right? So I think we're in the US, I don't know that we've found that balance really quite yet, and we're still kind of working it out. So it's something that you can be thinking about in Canada. How much do you want to restrict activities to reduce behavioral impacts versus what the consequences are, the maybe unintended consequences are of keeping boats out on the water much longer, or operating in multiple seasons, having to demobilize and remobilize and go out in a second year of activity, things like that. So then finally, stakeholders quickly. And in the US, our Bureau of Ocean Energy Management manages this type of stuff. So they sell the leases and are the main authority for authorizing activities on offshore wind leases. So they actually have a really it's very long, robust process, and there's a lot of places for stakeholders to be engaged in it, even starting at the very beginning. In a lot of cases, they really have started with interagency task forces in different states. So if a state has expressed an interest, then they create a task force that brings together the state and federal agencies, some tribes and different organizations. And it's public, and they have public process, and they have public comment and all that kind of thing. And then when they actually go to the point of starting to develop lease areas, they go through a multi-step process where they ask for calls for information about where people think there should be lease areas. They narrow it down to sort of what they call a call area off of a state or a few states. Then they analyze information within that. They ask for more public input. They create wind energy areas out of that. Then they propose, then they get public input on that, and then they propose lease areas within those wind energy areas and get public input on that. And then they move forward with actual leasing. And then once leases have been purchased, they also go through an entire process. Well, even before that, they do an environmental assessment on the site assessment work that will be done for the lease. So like the HRG surveys and things and mid-ocean buoys and stuff like that, where the public can input. And then they go through a process of all the authorizations that are necessary. And there's, again, a lot of places where the public does input. And then there's an environmental impact assessment that's done for each individual project, or in the case of California and New York, they're doing programmatic assessments that will then have, I think, supplemental individual assessments attached to them. So those are two places where the public can engage. So there's a lot of public engagement. I think that's really valuable and important. I don't know a lot about what Canada's process is for leasing areas for offshore wind, but the more public engagement and the earlier you can make it, the better off you're gonna be, I think. We also have a number of organizations. I've mentioned the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance before. There's also a Responsible Offshore Development Association that's sort of it's more of an advocacy group, I would say, but the concept is that in the US, a lot of stakeholders have kind of bonded together to create certain advocacy groups or certain organizations to like represent them in the context of offshore wind development, and fisheries is one of those, and that's where RODA comes in with working with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on addressing fisheries issues. So I would imagine you could see some of that in Canada as well, where people are going to kind of get together to work through issues together. At the state level, there's been a lot of work done. Each of our individual states kind of does it sort of does its own thing with buying power, and so this is where the states only have jurisdiction out to 3 miles and the ocean, but they buy the power. So this is where they have some say in what happens, and they can make sort of conditions on what it is that they're willing to buy. So at the state level, they've put together a number of working groups. A lot of states have done this. Massachusetts also, like this is just New York here, but there's lots of states have done this where they create these working groups. They have different stakeholders in the working groups. They get feedback from those stakeholders. They have workshops, they have committees, they have all kinds of technical working groups. And then they develop different stakeholder strategies. This one picture here is just out of the New York State stakeholder strategy. And you can see that Indigenous nations is separated out here. I don't know a whole lot about Canada's. I know you refer to it as First Nations. We usually have tribal nations is the reference here, and we have some tribes are federally recognized, some are state recognized. So they have like particular legal recognition and sovereignty that allows for intergovernment engagement. And then there's other tribes that don't have that recognition. So there's different ways that we interact, but they're not really considered stakeholders. Stakeholders are more in the public sphere, and the tribal nations are sort of their own sovereign entities. So we don't lump them in with the stakeholder groups. Getting down to the local level, a lot of the wind companies here have been doing a lot of local projects and engagement. And part of what the federal government has done in some of the more recent lease sales is they've added community benefits bidding points. They've done that with fisheries, I think, as well, where so like the amount of money that you spend on the lease, they allow some of it to be set aside. And instead of paying it into the federal government, that amount of money has to be spent on community benefits or fisheries benefits or things like that. So it's a way to get some of that done within the same bucket of money that you're leasing with. So that's kind of nice. that's not true of every one of the lease sales that's happened here, but the more recent ones, they've been doing that. And that's been providing a good opportunity for the wind companies to really get down on the ground and be part of useful community structure to help create job training opportunities, to support various educational programs. So this has been a good thing at the local level for us. And as I mentioned, the First Nations concept, we've had some struggles with this, and of course, historically, our setup for the federal legal framework is not, I think, as robust as Canada's for this process. And we did have, particularly on the West Coast, there's been some. I live on the West Coast, so I'm in Oregon, and so there were groups of tribes that got together to kind of send some letters to the governor here and to the federal government, trying to kind of get a better, more robust process for their engagement. And there's a lot of concern. I think part of the problem in the U.S. is that we tend to define who has an interest in something by proximity, more so than really looking at the big picture of interest. So for example, here on the West Coast, we have offshore wind farms off of California, or we don't have offshore wind farms yet, but we have leases that were sold off of California. And so the tribes that are in Washington or Oregon have concerns about that because their resources are in the California current ecosystem, and fisheries can shift along the entire coast, things like that. But there was a hesitation to acknowledge that tribes outside of California would have interests and should be engaged, which, so that's something to think about in Canada. And again, you may have a much more robust process, so maybe this isn't a problem for you, but just figuring out how to define who has an interest, and how, what consent you need, and how you want to go about doing this is better done early in process, and not waiting until you've gotten far enough along that you're getting letters sent to your federal government about not having enough Indigenous engagement. So that would be my advice on that. All right, well, that was a lot of talking. I will stop here and let folks ask questions, and I think Alyssa is going to man the chat there too. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah's information is up on this last slide for anybody who has follow-up questions that we don't have the time to get to today. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really helpful as an overview of the different kinds of effects that we can see, and some of the latest mitigation measures. Very helpful as we're at the earliest stages in Canada. So I think this is a really, really helpful way to set the stage. We have some questions coming in through the Q&A function already. So to get started, I think this question came in when you were discussing potential, like the reef, like the offshore wind platforms can create artificial reefs or attract species. Can you comment on invasive species in that context, or are there risks around invasive species with offshore wind farms being built?
There potentially can be. I mean, what it creates is a connectivity, so you have hard structure. So this has come up more for us in the Great Lakes than it has in marine environments necessarily. But so for example, in the Great Lakes, you have invasive zebra mussels that like to be on hard structure. So, where you did have a mud habitat, you're now creating hard structure, and that can allow those types of invasives to move, through an area because you've created hard structure for them. So it depends on the type of invasive. You will get encrusting organisms on turbines and things in the marine environment. There can be some shift in whether it increases or decreases biodiversity, it can shift some of the species, the proportion of different species that are present, because you're going to have encrusting organisms. If if that allows for some connectivity for some particular type of invasive, then that can be a problem. I mean, it's definitely something to look at. I haven't seen that as a huge issue. Again, in like the deep water marine environment, probably isn't a major problem. But as you get more into coastal areas or lakes and things like that, you have a bit more of that.
This question is about decibel levels. So in terms of offshore wind farm construction, installation, operation, are there studies that compare the decibel levels we see with offshore wind activities to other types of ocean noise, like marine vessels or sonar? Yeah, that kind of comparison. Has there been work done on that?
There have been some data collected in real systems, both in Europe and the US, in terms of like pile driving noise in the environment for turbine installation. The actual decibel level isn't the only thing of interest, because like hearing also is related to frequency and some other factors that just sheer decibels isn't necessarily. We use that as a threshold in the US too, where we're like, you can only have a received level of this many decibels kind of thing. But animals react differently depending on whether or not it's within their best hearing range, or whether it's masking noise that's in ranges that they need to hear. There is a lot of noise in the ambient environment that is that commenter pointed out there. That you have wind and rain and other and then vessels underlying vessel noise. The idea that like when you put vessels out to do offshore wind work, like you're going to go do operations in offshore wind, the number of vessels associated with that comparative to the number of vessels that are out there for all kinds of other stuff, the amount of noise you're actually contributing relative to that is probably not a whole lot. But I think that we need to do some more of that. I'm hopeful as we start installing some wind farms here in the US at larger scale that, I believe that they do have a requirement to collect some of that data in the field to demonstrate that, for example, their bubble curtains and things are actually doing the sound dampening that they claim that they're going to do. So there will be some real data sets, I think, available, and probably publicly available, because the government is requiring these data be collected, so that we should be able to get access to that as we get more wind farms installed.
Okay. Thank you. So this question is about adopting new monitoring technologies. So sometimes we see resistance to new monitoring technology. Can you speak to how best to navigate the introduction of novel monitoring techniques with regulators?
Yeah, that's a problem here, certainly, too. One of the things that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management here has tried to do is include language in the EIA context where you say things like this, you're going to do this or equivalent, or they call it new and unusual technologies too. If a new and unusual technology can be demonstrated to have an equivalent or lesser impact than the thing that we analyzed, then it can be considered to be covered by this assessment kind of a thing. So it does become, the onus does end up being on the technology developer, or the wind developer who wants to use the technology, to demonstrate adequately that the technology meets sort of like it doesn't exceed the impact of whatever it was that the agencies were expecting you to use. That can be really challenging. You do have to collect some scientific data. I think that's one of the problems that we run into. The tech developers don't always, like, they model a lot of things, but they don't necessarily have in-field studies, which is hard to get because you still don't have the permit to do the thing in the field until you demonstrate, right? So it is a little bit challenging, but I suggest that people go and sort of socialize these things with the regulators early. if you have a technology concept that they're not going to be familiar with, everybody in that office is just a person, right? I mean, they have the expertise they have, and so when we walk in there cold and you want a permit next week and they don't know anything about your technology, that's a hard way to get an okay, right? So if you're checking in with them periodically while you're developing the technology, if you're going to see that, if let's say you're a developer, you want to use new technology, don't wait till you want the permit right away. Go in and see them earlier, talk about the technology. How does it work? What kind of demonstration does the agency want to see in order to feel comfortable with that technology? Then you can probably transition it a little bit better. At least that's been my experience here in the US, where and you have to go to see all the agencies that have interests. Like, not just here, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is our lead agency, but it's not the only agency that is permitting or matters, right? So like our fisheries service is like the equivalent of your DFO. You want to go see them because they've got some permits that are going to be involved usually in whatever that technology is. And so you got to kind of take the time and whatever the expense is to go out and really do early agency engagement, I think, and to think about how you can demonstrate equivalence or improvement over what it is that they're already doing.
That makes sense. But this question came in and it builds on what you just mentioned about the different sort of regulatory agencies, and foam being the lead one, and we have multiple ones. Because we're such at the beginning stages in Canada, we're not clear yet on exactly what regulatory parties are going to be involved. That work is being done, and different regulations are being developed. But having multiple regulators has been a challenge for other marine renewable energy industries, like tidal, for example. Can you comment at all on that? Is there really a preference in terms of one regulator versus many? Have you seen a good way of handling that kind of issue?
It's
a tough one.
I suspect you probably are going to have similar problems to us in that context. I think for me, I try to keep in mind that each of the regulatory agencies and offices, like it could even be different offices within the same agency sometimes, that handle different statutes, right? What you really have is a suite of statutes, right? And so whatever they're trying to achieve, like here we have Endangered Species Act. They are trying to make sure that you're not going to cause jeopardy to the species that you're interacting with. Our Marine Mammal Protection Act says you can't have more than negligible impacts and small numbers of animals affected. That each statute has some threshold, right? That each of those people is just trying to deal with their own statute. It's kind of like having 6 college professors and none of them know that that they all scheduled the final exam on the same day, right? Like, they're not really interacting. And the best thing would be, I think, if there were a better way for them to interact. The US did set up, like I said, what we called Fast 41. It's a Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, I believe. And the idea is that you're supposed to do one EIA for all of the permitting and requirements across all of the agencies for those types of projects, and which offshore wind can be. You can opt into that as a developer. And then they create a dashboard and they try to set up a schedule that shows like all of the different consultations and permitting processes within the context of the EIA being done, right? So that has had some benefit. It's something Canada might think about, how you could, if you don't already structure. In the US, our government produces the EIA too. I don't know that's quite the same in Canada. So maybe doesn't work quite as well. But at least the permitting agencies, anyone who has to give you an authorization of some kind or be consulted in the process by other agencies, could get together and create sort of a roadmap and schedule. And then you can kind of see, if you go onto the dashboard, you can kind of see where, if there's a snag, what the reason is and what's going on. So you can try to address bottlenecks. So there is there is some of that, but I would say it's been a little rocky here. It's it's different than Europe. Europe, I think, has a little bit smoother process of integrating things, and individuals matter a lot. too. Like the individual people can sometimes just maybe not get along with each other or whatever, and then you end up with poor communication among agencies sometimes on a case-by-case basis, right? Like it's not necessarily pervasive across all of the agencies, but my philosophy, our country has been trying to top down this. I don't know if you may have seen, like we just passed an act, an FRA, I forget what that stands for now off the top of my head, but that one like restructured a couple things in our National Environmental Policy Act under which we write our EIAs. I don't think any of that, my personal opinion is that that's not necessarily that helpful if you haven't affected how it is done on the ground, right? Like the people who are actually know where the bottleneck is on the ground kind of need to solve that, not edicts from above to do something different don't necessarily, to say, oh, get this done in 2 years or whatever. Well, if you haven't given us the reason we weren't getting it done in 2 years, there are reasons for that. So we haven't addressed those reasons at all. You just said, do it, So there has to be some process to address the reasons. So I think you would probably want to lay out a roadmap. State of California has kind of taken the lead in this on the in for their offshore wind work, and like setting up between states and federal government too. You guys would have provinces and federal government. You want to like create some roadmaps and process so that it's not ambiguous for developers what it is that you need in order to meet your statutory requirements across there's a lot of statutes at both levels. So that would be my recommendation, is to start thinking about how you can make roadmaps and integrate processes, and then find where those bottlenecks are and think about on the ground, how can you get those bottlenecks worked out rather than top down, but maybe more bottom up.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So being conscious of time, maybe we'll take 2 more questions if that's okay with you, and then there's a lot more of them in there, so we'll do our best to try to address some of these in the future. But one question is about, and we've gotten it in our interaction with stakeholders as well in the fisheries in Canada. So can you talk about the data to support claims that power cables, offshore wind power cables, emit electromagnetic fields, and that this can have an impact on species? So is this, is there data on this? Is it easily mitigated? Maybe a little bit on EMF would be helpful.
Yeah, that one is actually, there are a lot of data on that. We've done a number of studies in the US on that. We did some on the East Coast regarding elasmobranchs, like the sharks and rays and such, which are electrosensitive fishes. And then lobsters was another specific target of that research. There's also been research on the West Coast looking at bottom fishes, sturgeon, things that like there were concerns that if you put a cable in the underground, that fish wouldn't cross it, right? So they did, you don't want to create a barrier to movement for fish. So far, none of that research has suggested that there is any major impact to electrosensitive animals, as long as you're using some sheathing or burial or other, like we typically use some mitigation around that to try to restrain the amount of EMF that's emitted. Some animals will be slightly attracted or slightly repelled from those, like within a few meters of the cable itself, but not to the extreme that it like creates barriers or anything like that. So I feel pretty comfortable with the data thus far, indicating that that's probably not a major problem that we have to spend a huge amount of time on, as long as people are using appropriate sheathing. If you're in mid-water, like you're talking about floating wind, you would definitely need to be thinking about the sheathing on it. Whenever you're in shallower systems, you're typically going to be burying, unless you're on rocky substrates, you're going to be burying the cable. So we've set up in the US like a certain depth for like our Army Corps of Engineers is once things buried at certain depths where it has to balance, like you can't have too much heat, right? If you bury it too deep, it can overheat, right? So you have to have it right at the right spot in the depth where you're not going to destroy the cable function itself, but you're going to minimize the amount of heat, vibration, and EMF that you get out into the marine environment. So that one I don't feel too nearly as concerned about as some of the other issues that we're trying to mitigate.
Okay. And last question for now in the live setting. What measures would you recommend to enable coexistence between offshore wind and fisheries industries, or and if there are other stakeholders that you want to comment on, go for it. But if you've seen anything that's particularly been helpful in the U.S. context, it's definitely a big issue that we want to approach thoughtfully here in Canada.
Yeah, it's certainly a big issue. And I think Canada is probably like the US, where our goal is to optimize access for fisheries. We do not want to create areas that are just completely inaccessible to fisheries if that can be avoided, right? In Europe, they have done that in some cases where they just say, okay, you can't fish here. That's not how we have taken the tact we have taken with it. So I think you're going to want to be working early with fisheries. And again, don't walk in the room and say, where do you fish? That's not really super helpful. I mean, you can ask that question at some point if they have certain areas that are really particularly important, but most of the time fisheries operate on markets and weather and fuel costs and other things affect like what they're fishing for, where they're fishing. Looking at the last 5 years of where fisheries operated doesn't necessarily tell you what the next 5 years is going to look like. So to some extent, and then you factor climate change in on top of that, right? Where animals are moving around and fishermen are going to go where there's fish, right? So there's, it's really hard to ask someone that, like, what part of the ocean don't you need is, that's not really helpful. But I do think that, again, going into the conversation with, okay, well, how could we, one thing you can ask is, how could we help you catch more fish? What's information? What are data that you need, right? Because you're going to have, again, this platform of opportunity out there. How can we design, before I've engineered everything and then I come to you and say, here's what I'm putting in the water. How can I design things to make it easier for you to fish near them or make it safer? Like you might say it's okay for you to fish near it, but if they don't feel like it's safe and they might collide with a structure or snag something, they're not going to be able to fish there, effectively. You are excluding them. So you have to find ways that you can engineer and organize and create corridors, and have transit corridors and along multiple wind farms. This is one of the things we learned kind of the hard way on our first few projects. Individual companies, setting up wind farms, you have to actually have them all work together to create connected corridors. You can't just have everybody doing what they want on their separate spot that are adjacent to each other. So you want to be in there early, figuring out, what's the strategy. And that's true for safety too. Like our Coast Guard also was heavily involved, not just fisheries, in that structural stuff, because they do search and rescue. They have, our Navy was involved, so you're going to want to get the stakeholders that need to navigate in the ocean. Really, the earlier you can work with them to make sure that you're setting up something that is going to be safe for them to navigate through and maximize access, is, I think, important. And then again, providing some benefit to them, like, here are these data that you wouldn't otherwise have, or here's this platform, we'll let you go out on our boat and do this thing, or whatever it is that gives them, or we're going to hire your boat to do this. You're a fisherman, we're going to pay you for this work. They're not, I mean, the compensation is a part of this, but most fishing, at least in our experience, I think most fishermen do not necessarily just want to be compensated. They want to have their job, so you don't want to think of it as just, well, we'll just pay people to not be fishing here. That's not really, and that's not good for food security or other things either. I mean, fisheries are an important part of the economy. So those are some suggestions, but it is hard. I mean, and there will be people who don't, I mean, you're always going to have some people who you're going to have trouble finding common ground with, but that's what you really have to do, is look for the common ground. What can we do working together? What's our Venn diagram where we overlap, and then we're going to work to benefit you there.
Yeah, it speaks very much to the importance of early and often for stakeholder engagement, I think it sounds like.
For sure, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for your time and for taking a little bit extra of your time today. As I said, there's lots more questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all today, but I really want to thank you, Sarah, for your time and for going over just a really great presentation for us in the Canadian context, really wonderful to set the stage as we think about these important issues. So thank you for your time. And I will just let everybody know still on the webinar that we do have another Ask an Expert webinar coming up in February of 2024. And we will be delving a little bit deeper into the regulatory processes question. So looking at how offshore wind can be governed. So there's lots of different questions that go into this. It's a huge piece of the puzzle, and we're very excited to be delving into that topic next. So thanks everyone for coming, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.